Somehow the existence of British illustrator Lewis Baumer had completely eluded me until a few months ago. How I could have got to be this old without previously encountering his work is one of life's great mysteries. Bauma was born in 1870 in London, and in his later teens he studied at St John's Wood Art School and the Royal College of Art. Once his studies were complete, he quickly found favour as an illustrator with several London-based magazines. His first commission was for the Pall Mall magazine in 1893, and soon after his pen and ink illustrations also began to appear in others, such as The Bystander and The Sketch. He also had some early success with children's books, including his own story Jumbles in 1897. In the same year he made his first appearance in Punch, and this would go on to be his most enduring professional collaboration. In his cartoon work, Bauma was essentially a social humorist, and he used the British class system to poke fun at all aspects of life as experienced by the haves and have-nots, and the comical collision of the two. He also had a successful parallel career as an artist, and he regularly exhibited and sold his watercolours and etchings. In 1903 his children's picture book Did You Ever was published, and this charming absurdist collection also enjoyed popular success. In the coming years his work for Punch and other magazines dominated his output, but he continued to illustrate books intermittently. In 1912 he illustrated The Perfect Gentleman by Harry Graham, and a year later his illustrated edition of Thackeray's novel Vanity Fair was published. This book in particular demonstrated just how consummate his skill with watercolour was, and he created a series of elegant, socially revealing images which constituted the perfect realisation of Thackeray's narrative. He returned to broader humour with another Harry Graham book, The Complete Sportsman, in 1914, and with the outbreak of war he also created a satire of Kaiser Wilhelm, portraying him as a warmongering dachshund. But that project aside, he generally stuck to his more good-natured material. Following the war, he continued to be a ubiquitous presence in Punch, and his upbeat outlook was just what the war-wearied British public needed to lift their spirits. As the 1920s unfolded, Punch began to feature colour illustration, and Bauma was a frequent choice to decorate the magazine's pages with his comical watercolours satirising British social life in the decade. Although he didn't create much advertising work, he did produce some charming press ads inviting young ladies to get addicted to nicotine. In 1925 he illustrated a book of poems by children's author Enid Blyton entitled Silver and Gold, which was yet another popular success. And so was his own 1928 book Bright Young Things, which cheerfully satirised the 1920s and particularly the new breed of young female known as the flapper. In the later 1920s and into the 30s, the society magazine The Tatler published many of his light-hearted satires and portraits of young women, and for a while they became known as the Bauma Girls. During the Second World War, any evidence of Bauma's work faded from view. This isn't surprising, because he would have been 75 when the war ended, and it's almost certain he retired. And Lewis Baumer died in 1963 at the age of 93. French illustrator Georges Barbier has already featured briefly in a couple of other videos, but his work is easily worth a more extended appreciation. He was born in the town of Nantes in the west of France in 1882, and not much is known about his early life other than that he attended the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in 1907, when he would have been 25. Why he had this relatively late start I don't know, but once he'd completed his art studies he quickly found favour in 1911 in the world of Parisian haute couture. He featured regularly in La Gazette du Bon Temps with fashion illustrations which he created with pen and ink, and which were coloured by the pochoir stencil method. And from this point on, his pioneering modernist approach to figure work would also feature frequently in other style magazines including Vogue and La Vie Parisienne. The bigger circulations of these magazines meant the pochoir wasn't a practical option, and he would have created his images complete with washes of colour for printing by conventional offset lithography. One of the key defining features of his work was his use of scenes with suggestions of narrative, rather than simply women in dresses, and this broadened the appeal of his work. Consequently, he also created quite a lot of book illustration during his career. His first was the erotic series of poems, The Songs of Bilitis, in 1914. The book claimed to be a translation from ancient Greek, but was in fact a contemporary fabrication. Nevertheless, it was extremely popular and immediately considered a collector's item. From early on in his career, he also designed theatre and ballet costumes, and in the 1920s his reputation spread to Hollywood, and he created costumes for silent films starring screen idols including heartthrob Rudolph Valentino. And if that wasn't enough, he was successful as a designer of wallpaper and worked for Cartier designing wildly expensive Art Deco jewellery. In 1928, Barbier returned to book illustration with a limited edition set of highly absorbing pochoir prints for Paul Verlaine's 19th century Fête Galante, and Barbier's visualization of the verse met with similar success to his earlier Songs of Bilitis. And in 1930 he followed this with the publication of yet another notorious erotic work, Liaison Dangereuse by Pierre Calderos de Laclos. Although fairly candid in their portrayal of sexual encounters, these exquisite images were saturated with aesthetic beauty. But unfortunately, at the height of his success, Barbier died in 1932 when he was just 50 years old. I have no idea why American illustrator Amos Sewell isn't better known. He was both prolific and successful in his lifetime, but he seems to have been relatively overlooked in the years after his death. He was born in 1901 in Oakland, California, and when his father died 5 years later, he was raised by his mother. In 1921, he took a job in a bank and also took night classes at the California School of Fine Arts. In his spare time, he drew monochrome story illustrations and mailed them to various pulp magazine publishers. And before long, he sold his first drawings to the publishers Street and Smith. He continued to make extra income this way for the next few years, but in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash, Sewell lost his job at the bank. In 1930, with nothing else to lose, he sailed from San Francisco to New York and headed for the offices of Street and Smith in the hope of more regular freelance illustration work. This risky venture paid off, and they obliged, mostly with interior monochrome illustrations for several of their magazines. And he also got to create the occasional colour cover. By his mid-30s, things were going well enough for him to feel financially secure, and he got married and bought a house in Connecticut. In 1936, he began to get assignments from what were called the slick magazines, so called because of the superior quality glossy paper they were printed on. This work was considerably better paid than that published in the pulp magazines. Among his new prestigious clients were the Country Gentleman and the Elks, and a little later the Saturday Evening Post. His association with the Post turned out to be his most successful, and for decades to come he provided them with a large number of all-American good-natured covers. I probably don't need to mention it, but he was of course most commonly using oil paint, and was to my untrained eye at least the equal of just about any other representational painter I can think of, including Rockwell. But I checked a couple of auction sites and some of his originals were created in gouache too, and such was his skill with either, it's fairly hard to spot the difference. He also produced many narrative interior illustrations in both colour and monochrome halftone to accompany the fiction which featured in all the magazines he worked for. During World War II, he also produced many striking domestic propaganda posters for the government's War Manpower Commission. In the later 40s and into the 50s, Sewell's success continued undiminished, and the volume of figurative work he created showed him to be every bit as prolific and enduring as any of his contemporaries. The evidence, or more correctly the lack of it, suggests he retired in the early 1960s, and the last dated examples I've been able to find are a handful of covers for the Post in 1962. And Amos Sewell died at the age of 82 in 1983. Don Freeman was born in San Diego in 1908 and later studied at the School of Fine Arts there. And in 1928, just like Amos Sewell, he sailed to New York and paid for his passage by playing the cornet with the ship's orchestra. With spectacularly bad timing, he arrived just days before the stock market crash of 1929 and was obliged to continue to earn what money he could as a dance band musician. But he also used his time wisely studying graphics and lithography at the Art Students League of New York. Early on in his career, he generally worked as a social realist, and although some of these images were reproduced in books and magazines, most were exhibited and sold as limited edition lithographs. His admiration for the work of 19th century French lithographer Honoré Daumier was clearly visible both in terms of his stylistic approach and his choice of subjects. Then in 1940 he illustrated the book My Name is Aram, written by William Saroyan. And during the coming decade a couple of others were published, and this association significantly raised Freeman's profile as an illustrator. His own book It Shouldn't Happen was published in 1945, and another collection of his earlier work, Come One Come All, followed in 1949. In 1951 he collaborated with his wife Lydia Freeman on their first children's book. This was the story of Chuggy and the Blue Caboose, and it was a popular success. More books by Freeman, including more collaborations, followed throughout the decade, but he continued with his printmaking, and his illustrations also appeared in various publications, including the New York Times. In 1959 he had two significant and quite dissimilar successes with the picture books Norman the Doorman and Space Witch. Although I can't find definitive proof, it seems likely that the charming, highly textured illustrations for Norman the Doorman were created using pastels and wax crayon. Other similar work by Freeman, being sold at auction, is credited as such. In a completely different style and technique, Space Witch used a two-colour palette and appears to have been illustrated with either scraperboard or maybe lino cut. Again, I can't find definitive information. Several more books, each exploring various facets of Freeman's style and technique, followed throughout the 60s and 70s. Undoubtedly his biggest commercial success was the book Corduroy in 1968. The heartwarming story of the bear character was instantly popular with children and their parents, and is still in print. In later life, Freeman and his wife moved from New York to Santa Barbara, California, but he never retired, and he continued to write and illustrate yet more children's picture books for the following decade, up to his eventual death in 1978 at 70 years old. And that's the end of this instalment, and I hope you'll return when the next one's ready.